Chris Richard, as his influence on the Cowboys defense, and watching him work with this young secondary and watching how they respond to him. And I think that a lot of it was, I have an idea what the players might do, but you never know with coaches. I'm really good friends with John Snyder, who's the GM of the Seahawks. And John was telling me about, Chris, when he was there, he goes, hey, he's going to make his players accountable. He's going to be on top of them. And John hasn't, he didn't fool me on that one.
Today is Friday, June 15th. This is the Cowboys Beat on CLNS Media. I'm Ari Temkin. In 1991, the Cowboys were a young, up-and-coming team with a young roster. They had just gone 11-5, went second in the NFC East Division, won their wild card playoff game against the Bears, and then lost the divisional round to the Lions. Got smoked by the Lions, if you recall, in 1991. 92, the Cowboys came back and won a Super Bowl. And one of the most important pieces to helping them win that Super Bowl and get over the top was Charles Haley, a guy that had been part of San Francisco 49ers championship squads of the past, a guy that brought much-needed leadership and know-how, having been part of the mountaintop, to the Dallas Cowboys 92 roster. They went out and won a Super Bowl. I'm not suggesting the Cowboys are about to win a Super Bowl. What I am suggesting, though, is that the Dallas Cowboys have a situation right now very, very similar to 1991. A young roster up and coming with the ability to add a veteran dominant player along their defense that I believe they're about to add. Earl Thomas, a free safety who's been a dominant player in the National Football League and probably one of the best and most important players for the Seahawks Legion of Boom, said that he wanted to play for the Cowboys last season after the Seahawks beat Dallas, and he was photographed telling Jason Garrett as much after the game. He then said throughout the offseason that he was going to hold out unless he got a long-term deal. He's playing out the last year of his contract, and he spent 3 weeks in voluntary OTAs, sitting out, and now with mandatory minicamp having been here and gone, Earl Thomas released a statement saying that he wasn't going to be a part of it, that he wanted a long-term deal, and that he was not going to be participating in any mandatory minicamps or any future activities with the Seahawks unless he got a long-term deal done. Earl Thomas is about to become the Charles Haley of the modern era for the Dallas Cowboys, the perfect veteran player who's won championships, coming in at a spot sorely needed by the Dallas Cowboys. And I think the Cowboys have been planning the entire offseason for this. You look at what they did during the draft. Cowboys did not go out and spend draft capital to shore up free safety. We know Jeff Heath's going to be the strong safety. Byron Jones played free safety last year. They transitioned Byron back to cornerback. That's the other thing, too. They have a ton of good young corners in Chidobe Awuzie, Jordan Lewis, Anthony Brown, Xavier Woods. They've got pretty good numbers at the cornerback position, so why would they take a free safety and Byron Jones that's been playing free safety the last couple of years where they don't have good numbers and move him to corner where they have lots of depth and good numbers there? It makes no sense unless you believe, without investing any draft capital, they're going to be in position to get a guy like Earl Thomas. And here's the thing. Earl Thomas said that he was going to hold out unless he got a long-term deal. It's one thing to say it, it's another thing to do it. Well, he's doing it. And that's a really important thing to note. The longer this goes, if it gets into training camp and Earl Thomas continues to hold out, the more and more Seattle's going to have to unload him. And Seattle wants to unload him. They're not going to give him a long-term deal. Seattle is rebuilding. Remember, Seattle built a championship roster by having a young quarterback and Russell Wilson on a rookie deal, so they could spend more in other spots. Well, they are no longer have that luxury, so they had to get rid of Richard Sherman. They've had to get rid of expensive defensive players along that were dominant parts to their defense. Michael Bennett, Cam Chancellor. They had to get rid of all of these guys throughout this offseason because they needed to rebuild their defense in the exact opposite way that they built up the Legion of Boom. They built the Legion of Boom with a young quarterback on a rookie deal and dominant defensive players. Well, now it's flip-flopped. Now they have a franchise quarterback that they have to then mold with young players along their defense through the draft. So they have no use for Earl Thomas. They want to trade him. They're not going to give him a long-term deal, not at 29 years old. So, and in addition to that, they're going to save $8.5 million against the cap if they release him or they trade him. So it makes no sense for them to keep him. So Seattle wants to trade him and get rid of him. The Cowboys, of course, have a drastic need at free safety. Though they've had Xavier Woods filling in that spot at free safety, they could drastically upgrade that position with a dominant player like Earl Thomas. Oh, and by the way, they've got Earl Thomas's former defensive coordinator and Chris Richard now manning the passing game for their defense. It all makes perfect sense, and it's a big reason why the Cowboys, and maybe more particularly Stephen Jones, have been planning for it all offseason. Earl Thomas will be with the Dallas Cowboys. Mark my words. Earl Thomas will be with the Dallas Cowboys. And remember, it started this offseason with the Seahawks wanting a first-round pick for Earl Thomas. There wasn't a chance in hell the Cowboys are going to give up a first-round pick for Earl Thomas. Then going into the draft, I think the Cowboys had an interest level in giving up a second-round pick for him. But when it came around to Connor Williams being available, all of a sudden now they didn't want to trade a second-round pick for him because they'd rather have Connor Williams instead of Earl Thomas. And I agree with them. In fact, I was never going to be giving up a second-round pick for Earl Thomas. The equal and fair compensation for Earl Thomas is a third-round pick, and that's where I think the Cowboys are at. And I think after they drafted Connor Williams on draft day, they more than likely offered a third-round pick to Seattle for Earl Thomas, and Seattle still said no because they wanted to get the height of his value. Well, Earl Thomas holds out from Earl Thomas holds out from mandatory minicamp. He's going to keep holding out from training camp. You don't want a player on your roster that doesn't want to be there long term, and if you're Seattle, you of course don't want him to be there long term, so now the value has gone down. So now if you're Seattle, you pick up the phone, you call the Cowboys, you say, all right, you know how we offered you a first round pick? We'll take a second round pick now. And then the Cowboys are going to counter with, how about a third round pick? And we'll see where that ends up. Now, you don't want to play, if you're the Cowboys, too much. You don't want to play around with this too much if you're the Cowboys, because there are other teams in the NFL that will want Earl Thomas. So you want to make sure you don't lowball too much to where you still get the deal done. But again, Seattle doesn't want Earl Thomas. Earl Thomas doesn't want to be in Seattle. He's saying he needs to get a long-term deal done. My guess is, though, that's just a reason for him to be out of Seattle. Oh, and by the way, to probably, if he's going to have to stay with the Seahawks, he wants that long-term deal so he has that security. Now, you might be thinking, if you're a Cowboy fan, well, what about the Cowboys? They're going to have to pay Dak here pretty soon. They're going to have to pay Zeke Elliott pretty soon. You're right. Now, they could afford him this year under the salary cap. The question is, does he still want that long-term deal? Now, my guess is he's going to want some semblance of it, but I know he wants to be with the Cowboys more than he wants that long-term deal. So, again, this is probably something the Cowboys are going to hash out before they trade for him, but my guess is it's not like the same things that he wants with the Seahawks are there with the Cowboys as well. You know, I tend to agree with the Cowboys' approach of not spending big-time money in free agency. You know, the Cowboys have been very much willing to invest in their younger players. You know, they're who they draft. So they've always been very careful. Not always. So they've more recently been very careful about not spending in free agency, and I agree with that approach for the most part. But if they are able to trade for Earl Thomas, then this will have been an absolute home run off season. They will have established their offensive line with the addition of Connor Williams, who many draft analysts had as one of the best offensive linemen in the draft. So they would have solidified the left guard position, which was a major issue for them last season. They would get back to having a dominant offensive line. Zeke Elliott is not going to face suspension this year. So they're going to have the dominant offensive line with a dominant running game. They impacted their defense with the draft pick of Leighton Vander Esch, who is a really, really good middle linebacker, sideline to sideline, ability to cover in space, all the things they haven't had at that position in a long time. They have clear, good young players along their secondary with Uzier and Jordan Lewis, who I think is a budding star in the NFL, Byron Jones, and then you add the veteran presence and leadership of Earl Thomas. A dominant player who's still playing at an extraordinarily high level, who can exemplify the traits and characteristics on the field that Chris Richard, the Cowboys' second in command on defense and de facto passing game coordinator, Earl Thomas will be there to exemplify and to play out the types of things that Chris Richard will be preaching day in and day out. Yes, if the Cowboys trade for Earl Thomas, which I believe they will, and Earl Thomas will play with the Dallas Cowboys, it will be the exact same move they pulled off during the offseason of 1991 when they had a young roster that had just made the playoffs and seemed to be one player away, and they added Charles Haley, and they went on to one of the most dominant stretches in NFL history. Granted, the Cowboys were 9-7 last year. There was no playoff appearance for them, and Jason Garrett is still their head coach. But when they acquire Earl Thomas, it'll be the most impactful move this franchise has had to acquire one of the most important pieces that they've been missing in the last 3 decades. I'm not calling the Cowboys to win a Super Bowl this year because I'm not completely crazy, but when the Cowboys trade for Earl Thomas, they instantly become, in my opinion, the best team in the NFC, despite the fact that nobody else will recognize them as being such. Coming up after our interview with DallasCowboys.com writer, podcaster, and former Cowboys scout Bryan Broaddus, I'll take a look at the linebacking core. But now let's talk with Bryan Broaddus, the great Bryan Broaddus, DallasCowboys.com, joining us right now on the Cowboys Beat on CLNS Media. Broaddus, how are you, buddy?
I'm doing well, man. I've missed you. I know we got to do a little radio the other day, but always enjoy visiting with you, and so happy to be with you today.
What's been your biggest takeaway, if you have one individually, of OTAs so far?
I think my biggest takeaway is what Chris Richard, has his influence on the Cowboys defense. And you're probably expecting me to say, oh, well, it looks like this player and that player and this player's done this and that and the other. And it's really not, I've been impressed with some players. And, matter of fact, I wrote about today on DallasCowboys.com, it being Friday, wrote about, my top 10 players, and not all are players that you would expect. But, I think the thing that I've been the most impressed by is that watching Chris Richard coach and watching him work with this young secondary and watching how they respond to him. And I think that a lot of it was, I have an idea what the players might do, but you never know with coaches. I'm really good friends with John Snyder, who's the GM of the Seahawks. And John was telling me about, Chris, when he was there, he goes, hey, he's going to make his players accountable. He's going to be on top of them. And John hasn't, he didn't fool me on that one. I mean, that's he's absolutely right. And I think that's what we try and get from OTAs initially is how are the coaches coaching the players? And I asked Jason Garrett this question the other day in the walk-off. I said, are you having to coach the coaches? Because they have a whole new staff of coaches here, if you want to really be honest about it, offensively and defensively. But the one I've really kind of taken a liking to is Chris Richard again, because I feel like that, he's going to give these guys an opportunity to be successful because he's going to put them in situations to be successful. So I think that's what you have to ask from your coaches, and I think that's where OTAs allows you to get a little bit better handle of that.
Explain to me the dynamic of Rod Marinelli is the defensive coordinator, but Chris Richard is the passing game coordinator. So, just explain that dynamic, how that works on a game day.
Well, and the great thing about working here at the Star is that, I get to have lunch or breakfast with Rod Marinelli. I mean, he's been very forthright and, coming up, and he and I share a love for, military history. And, so we always talk about Patton to start the day, and then it turns into, defensive talk after that. But, I think that he, what I'm seeing on the field, it looks like that they have their plays, scripted. The offensive has the play scripted, and then it's up to the defense to match what they're seeing, to the play. So, Chris Richard is, Marinelli's been there. They're all together, and Marinelli doesn't like signaling in plays. Like Chris Richard is physically signaling to the defense, telling him what he and Rod have talked about. And so, it's a role that they had the last couple of years with Matt Eberflus, who's now went on to the Colts as their defensive coordinator. I mean, Rod really leaned on Flus, to help with what's going on, the marriage between the front seven and the back end being the two safeties and the corners. So, you can't have really one without the other. I mean, Chris Richard will tell you that, hey, my job is to make sure that my guys deny routes. And it's Marinelli's and them's job to get to the quarterback. So any hesitation that they can make in the secondary, that's going to bode well for the front seven. So, with the way things are split up now, and the fact that Chris Richard was a defensive coordinator in this league, he has an understanding of how to stop people. His principles and the things that Rod Marinelli has kind of built here. There's going to be some differences as far as, okay, in this situation, I like to do this. Well, what, have you thought about doing it this way? And so that's what coaching is. It's trying to figure out, but you got a veteran seasoned coach with a young and upcoming coach who has called defenses. So that's a good thing right there. It's not just my way or the highway. It's hey, let's work together here. And Rod Marinelli is really, really excited about working with Chris Richard.
Which rookie has impressed you the most in OTAs?
I think it has to be Michael Gallup, and I've Gallup was drafted in the third round. There was some thought about, okay, would they go early on receiver? Would they go first 2 rounds on a receiver, or would they just wait and go a little bit later? And, I had Michael Gallup as one of my top 50 players before the draft. I mean, he was number 37 on my board.
Wow.
So I've thought enough of him to have him in my top 50. But he looks like, to me, if you watch him play, he can separate. He can go get the football. He's one of those guys that, the more you put him on the move, the better he plays. And I think that, they're going to continue to work with him. Sanjay Lyle, the receivers coach, harps on him every day about route running, about technique, about plant, turn, plant, extend, plant. It's always, the first 2 days of camp here, these receivers didn't catch a ball. It was all about technique work and stuff. And I think that Michael Gallup, the receiver from Colorado State, has come in here and embraced the opportunity with no Terrence Williams. They're trying to figure out things at the wide receiver spot. They're going to get the best, 5, 6 guys, and then that's what they're going to be. But they can't have this group not have success, because they do want to run the football. But if they don't have success, then it means, okay, teams are going to stack the box on him, and then now it's going to be a little bit more difficult for Ezekiel. Not that he hasn't faced stacked boxes before, but you need the threat on the outside, and it looks like that Michael Gallup, at least initially here, can give them some of the things that they're going to need on the outside.
And that's a great point, Broaddus. I mean, they can win some games playing against teams that bail out to stop the run, but they're not going to win. They're not going to go to the playoffs. They're not going to, they're not a Super Bowl team. I mean, to win at the highest level, they just can't consistently say, well, our approach is, if we can't pass the ball, we're going to continue to run the ball, because it might work 1 or 2 weeks, but it's not going to work overall.
No, you're absolutely right. And in Ezekiel Elliott, they'll try. They'll keep, that's a team that will run the ball, 46% of the time, and that's what Scott Linehan wants to do. But they need to figure out some things on the outside. And again, that's getting Cole Beasley going too. If you go back to 2016, Cole Beasley was so much a vital part of what they were doing offensively. When they run the football and they get 4 or 5 yards, and now it's 2nd and 5, and they're throwing play action, whether they're throwing it to Witten or, who's no longer in the mix. But, Cole Beasley, the underneath routes. Teams took him out of the game last year, and I think it really affected the way Prescott played. And people, the buzzword around here has always been, oh, hey, Dak friendly or Romo friendly or, whatever friendly, but make it friendly. To make it friendly for Dak, get Cole Beasley going again. I think that's one of those things that could really, really help him if they can do that.
Who's a guy that Cowboys fans don't know, or probably haven't heard his name, but you think will have an impact in the season this year?
Well, the one guy that I've really liked, that I've written about, and again, I have this top 10 list coming out Friday, this Friday, and I think people really are trying to get a handle on who Jihad Ward is, who they traded from the Raiders. Ryan Switzer, John Gruden. They were changing coaching staffs, and that happens a lot. When I was in pro personnel here with the Cowboys, you always follow the teams that have the new head coaches, because they're willing to move on from guys. Jihad Ward was a 2nd-round pick out of Illinois. A lot of people had him projected as a defensive end. Rod Marinelli had him in the Senior Bowl, put him at defensive tackle. And, this team has had a little bit of a struggle with what's gone on at defensive tackle. David Irving has had his off-the-field issues. Malik Collins has a hurt foot, and he's trying to rehab to get himself back to that. So there's been a little bit of depth issues there at the defensive tackle spot. So they trade for Jihad Ward, and, lo and behold, wearing helmets and T-shirts, but he's had his share of really positive, disruptive plays. And, all you can do is when you're playing this way in the T-shirts and helmets is you can win with quickness, you can win with power, and then you find a way to get into the backfield. And that's what he's been able to do. And these guards and centers have had a hard time blocking him. So I think people, when we get to Oxnard here in July 24th and start practice the 26th, that we're going to see, this Jihad Ward be a possibility of a guy that could be a starter for the Dallas Cowboys, either at the 1 or the 3 technique, along with David Irving, and then also with Malik Collins when he gets healthy enough to practice.
What's the biggest concern for them? Is it that defensive line because of all the issues with injuries and David Irving?
Yeah, I think it's the biggest issue is the wide receivers. I mean, I mentioned it's the cast of thousands. I mean, they've thrown numbers at the position. But who are the best 5? If you had to rank them, and we did the other day, we had Cole Beasley as the number 1 receiver. Well, in a normal offense, Cole Beasley might be your second, third, maybe even 4th receiver. So yeah, until somebody steps up, Michael Gallup steps up, Cedric Wilson steps up, Alan Hearns. They don't need Alan Hearns to be better than Des Bryant. If Alan Hearns were to get the numbers that Des Bryant had last year, I think they would be really, really happy about that. But they've got a lot of guys that they're, like I say, there's a lot of numbers, but who are the best 4 or 5 guys? And, the fact of the matter, too, is they're trying to figure out things at tight end, and they drafted Dalton Schultz, but, Jeff Swaim is the incumbent starter and replacing Jason Witten. And then, Blake Jarwin's done a pretty good job in these camps. But if you said to me, hey, what is the position wide receiver? They've got to find. It's not about finding a 1 overall. It's just about finding 5 guys that can make plays. That's the most important thing.
Every guest I've had on the Cowboys Beat, I've asked over under 9.5 wins. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think I'm going to go over, and but it's real close. 9.5. Give me a half more game, and I got 10. I do believe if there are going to be the struggles, because if there are struggles, it's because you're playing the 2 Souths. And I mean the 2 Souths, the AFC South and the NFC South. Carolina is one of the better teams. You'll know right off the block, right off the jump, how good your football team is in week 1 when you play Carolina. You got to go back to Atlanta. New Orleans comes here. That will be a difficult game. Tampa, can they turn things back around? Then you flip things on the other end, though. The AFC South, you look at Jacksonville's a much improved team. Houston's a team, I think, if they get the quarterback situation the right way, with what they've got right now, could very well. They're one of the most talented teams I've seen. Yeah. Indianapolis, are they going to have? Indianapolis is a team. The Cowboys play them very late in the year in December. What kind of shape will Andrew Luck be in at that point in time? And then Tennessee, of course, has a very talented roster as well. So any one of these teams, you can find a way to lose, 2 or 3 games. When the Cowboys win 13 games, they were able to run the AFC North. Win a game at Pittsburgh and kind of handle that, beat Baltimore at home. And then they found a way to beat the Packers and then also beat the Vikings. So, they didn't lose a game to the AFC North or NFC North. The only games they lost were divisional games. And, if they can find a way to do that, then, that team will be back up there. But Jason Garrett's job really depends on him finding a way to win 10, 11 games, potentially winning the division, getting in the playoffs, and then finding a way to go a couple of rounds. Because if that's not the case, this time next year, we will talk about a whole new coaching staff.
It's the great Bryan Broaddus. You can hear his podcast, Talking Cowboys. Check that out. Check out his great work for DallasCowboys.com, both in the written form and in the visual form. You can also hear him on 105 through the Fan. The very busy, the wonderfully talented Bryan Broaddus at DallasCowboys.com. Thanks, buddy.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate you.
Thank you to Bryan Broaddus for joining us on the Cowboys Beat. I'm Ari Temkin for CLNS Media. And as we move closer and closer to the regular season, I've been breaking down positional groups. In episode 4 of this podcast, I took a look at the wide receiving core. This week, I wanted to take a look at the Cowboys linebackers. And truthfully, When you look at the linebacking core last year, it lacked depth, and there's probably, beyond Zeke Elliott missing the time that he missed and Tyron Smith being out for as long as he was, if you want to single out one positional group on the defense that really dropped the ball, it was probably a major catalyst for the Cowboys missing out on the playoffs last year. Their linebacking core is a big, big reason for that. Sean Lee was in and out of the lineup for most of the year. So was Anthony Hitchens, who's now gone and in Kansas City. So the Cowboys were counting on Jalen Smith, who, because of the drop foot, really was not able to be a successful linebacker for them. And offenses completely took advantage of his inability to get sideline to sideline. And again, Tyron Smith and Zeke Elliott missing as much time as they missed last year, those are major contributors for the Cowboys missing the playoffs last year. But if you're looking for a reason defensively, the linebacking group last year could not get off the field. And it was, again, offenses routinely taking advantage of Jalen Smith in space. It was clear that they wanted to improve that linebacking core this offseason, and they have. And what's amazing is, you look at this linebacking group top to bottom, there aren't many spots up for grabs, which is kind of unique considering just how much this position lacked depth really the last few years. As for this year's linebacking core, the Cowboys figured that they were going to need to improve dramatically, and they did invest some capital this offseason in the linebacking group. They went out with the 16th overall pick and drafted Leighton Vander Esch, an inside linebacker from Boise State. They drafted Chris Covington, a linebacker in the 6th round from Indiana. They also went out and signed Joe Thomas, a free agent linebacker who's played pretty well in OTAs. So, I mean, they've got a pretty competitive group, and especially when you single out their top three, their starters, Sean Lee, Leighton Vander Esch, and Jalen Smith, this looks like one of the strengths of the defense, which is incredible to think of, considering just a year ago, it was a major reason why they missed the playoffs. Now, Sean Lee, again, has dealt with consistent injury issues throughout the course of his career, but has been on the field more consistently 83% of the time since being switched to the weak side will linebacker, which is a position he will continue to pursue this season. Leighton Vander Esch, their first-round pick out of Boise State, and a guy that is supremely athletic. It's well documented his history. He played 8-man football in Idaho growing up, which means he had to play a lot in pass coverage. He is very well equipped to be a modern-era NFL linebacker because of his ability, his athletic ability to play the pass, to go sideline to sideline, to backpedal, to defend the pass extraordinarily well, which is something the Cowboys really haven't had. You look at last season, Jalen Smith obviously had his limitations with drop foot, being able to go sideline to sideline. Sean Lee, he's their guy that can do that and make a ton of plays. The problem is, again, consistency with injuries. Here's the deal about Leighton Vander Esch. Leighton Vander Esch, Jalen Smith, and Sean Lee are their three best linebackers. And Lee and Vander Esch together are going to be a very, very formidable duo, especially when you put Jalen Smith in position to be more aggressive, to play up at the line of scrimmage and play straight line downhill. With Vander Esch, though, most importantly, he gives them a little bit of a hedge if an injury happens to Sean Lee. Now, again, you don't want to plan for that. And they know how much better they are with Sean Lee on their defense, not only from an on-the-field standpoint, but from a leadership standpoint. But Vander Esch provides a lot of the same attributes that Sean Lee does from a sideline-to-sideline, highly athletic ability. So when you look at the top three, Sean Lee, Leighton Vander Esch, Jalen Smith, then you have Damian Wilson, then Joe Thomas, who they signed in free agency, and again has had pretty good OTAs. That's 5. Now, depending on whether or not they're going to keep 6 or 7 on their roster, it's probably going to come down to Justin March Lillard or Chris Covington. Now, Damian Wilson's a guy they drafted pretty high a few years ago, so it's hard for me to think they'd cut him. But if he gets outperformed by a rookie 6th-round pick and Chris Covington and Justin March Lillard during training camp, there is a chance he could be on the outside looking in. At the same time, though, there's a chance the Cowboys could end up taking and keeping 7 linebackers, considering they kept Justin March Lillard around all last year, and Chris Covington's a 6th-round pick who they like a lot. Ultimately, though, the Cowboys' defense is going to be dramatically improved this season, and I think one of the main reasons for that is their linebacking core. They finally did an adequate job in trying to overcome some of the issues they've had with injuries, with problems, with the inability for athletic guys to go sideline to sideline. I think Leighton Vander Esch was a tremendous pick for the Cowboys, and at 16, I think he's going to end up being a very, very, very good player for them, especially when you look at their best three in Jalen Smith, Leighton Vander Esch, and Sean Lee. That's it for this week's edition of the Cowboys Beat right here on CLNS Media. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Make sure to hit the subscribe button no matter where you're streaming this from, whether it's on iTunes, Stitcher, or the CLNS Media app. Also, make sure to check out my show, Showtime, streaming every single day on Facebook at facebook.com/Watch Phantom. You can also follow me on Twitter at RESports, ARI Sports, for all the latest on your Dallas Cowboys as we get closer and closer to the season. We are just now a month and change away from training camp at Oxnard, California. So the season is closer and closer to being upon us. Halle freaking Luya. Next week, we'll take a look at some of the draft picks with Jonah Tolles, who is an NFL draft analyst for NDT Scouting, also covers the Cowboys. So Jonah Tolles will join the Cowboys Beat next week. Again, make sure to subscribe, tell your friends, make sure everybody subscribes and checks out the Cowboys Beat every single week right here on CLNS Media. And again, follow me on Twitter at RESports, ARI Sports. All right, but for now, I'm out. Peace.